South Australia is a terrible place to go and live at. It's just really boring. No one should come to South Australia. It is a terrible place to live in.
We always say that because we just think, right, if we tell everybody how nice it is, the whole world will come and live here in South Australia. But
that's right.
Always love to see anybody wants to come and visit us.
I used to live about a mile north of here, and I sold, it was a very similar property to this one, and I sold that house, and then I went overseas and I met Gwen, and when we came back to Australia, she was very keen to come back to live in the hills and have horses. So, maybe being the generous person I am, and trying to please Gwen in every way, found a property up here with a little transportable house on it, which was a 2-bedroom fibro thing. We bought the property with 7 acres in the fibro, and then we sold the fibro off and built a new house and bought the block next door, which means we have now a brick house and about 20 acres of land, half an hour's drive from the centre of Adelaide. The only regulations are regarding blocks like this is you cannot subdivide them up. You can add to them and redraw boundaries, but I couldn't decide tomorrow to divide this up into 20 different housing blocks.
And we couldn't decide to suddenly put in a crop here. We couldn't decide to have 20 acres of potatoes and water all the 20 acres of potatoes. But for a normal domestic block, we can do whatever we like.
If you want to irrigate things, you have to get a water licence.
Well, I thought it was lovely. I thought the weather would be nice and warm. And John had a horse, so I could actually, I could put up with him if it meant having a horse as well. No, I met John in Kathmandu and we have a lot in common. We both enjoy the travelling and we both enjoy the horses and the countryside. John had originally thought that the idea of running a resort in Fiji or something like that would be quite a good idea. But after he'd been travelling for a while, he thought, no, South Australia sounds good. And so we came back here. And I love South Australia. It's the highest point in South Australia, 727 metres. Then we go down the hill into what we call the bog because it's wet all year round, and if we wander around there too far we'll end up in water up to our knees. So you've got to be a bit careful when you walk down there. And then we come up the hill beyond the point that you can see to another couple of paddocks over there, which we call the orchard paddock. And generally we keep 3 or 4 horses. We have about 8 sheep, and we'll usually have about 4 steers on the property as well. The steers, we just buy them when they're about 6 months old or 4 months old and sell them when they're a year or so old. So they just fatten up here. But the sheep, we breed the sheep and eat the lambs. And the sheep are South Downs, which is an very old English breed, not very many of them. I think we probably have one of the only small flocks in South Australia. I know we do. So they're quite an unusual sheep, but they taste nice. I love the view, absolutely stunning views. I felt that it just felt like a lovely place to be. As soon as I walked onto the property, the house didn't worry me at all. It was just standing in the back garden and looking out, which in those days was a lot more open than it is now. I just thought it was a beautiful place to be. In the last 20 years since I've been here, there have been a huge amount of extra trees. So it was, obviously, the main landscape was the same, but there would be, I think, 10 times as many trees out there now as there used to be.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we belong to the Strathalbyn Hunt Club, which is basically a cross-country jumping club. And we go out with them each week in the winter. We also belong to the Adelaide Hunt Club, which is a fox hunting club, and we really enjoy riding with them because that's obviously a lot more unpredictable. One week you might do absolutely nothing, and then the next week you gallop madly all over the place, so that's also a lot of fun, and we go out with them quite often during the winter. In the summer we do a little bit of social riding with our friends. A lot of our friends either do hunting or they do show jumping or other things, but we have forests around here which we ride at. We also have what is known as our Thursday riding club. So a little group of us, each week a different person organises a ride and lunch. So we all convene at one person's house, and then we leave our horses in their paddocks, their property, and whoever's house it is gets to make lunch for everybody else. We picked this one up at the Gawler racetrack. His last race was on my birthday, 10th of January in, what year was that in? Whenever he was 6 years old. And he failed. He was doing a hurdle race and he came in 60 lengths behind the leader, so he was absolutely useless.
I was born in Adelaide. My parents, my father was from Adelaide, my mother was from the Yass district of New South Wales, off a property there. And I lived in Adelaide till I was about 10. And then I went back to New South Wales with my mother, where we lived there, and I got into horses and one thing or another. And then returned to Adelaide when I was about 16. And I've lived here pretty much ever since, enjoying horse riding and horses, moving to the hills when I was about 24, and I've enjoyed riding horses and living in the hills ever since. I think it's one of the nicest places in Australia and possibly the world to live, because you're within a short drive of a city with 1 million people, which gives you all the facilities, but you can also have the rural lifestyle in a nice Mediterranean climate.
And if I can just say one quick thing here,
No.
that's John's family's been in Australia for a long time, and his great, however many, grandmother was the first woman to cross the Blue Mountains, first white woman to cross the Blue Mountains. She carried a gun, smoked a pipe, lived to be 113 years old, and had how many grandchildren, descendants?
Over 100 descendants by the time she died at the age of 113. She and her husband George Davis were deported out here in the early days, and she was deported for stealing a necklace, which she always denied. And when she got out here, they actually found the necklace later, so in compensation they gave her a large land grant in the Yass and Canberra district of New South Wales as compensation, which they then farmed and lived very successfully on until her death at an advanced age. Up here we collect our own rainwater because we don't have town water on, so all the water comes off the roof and is collected in tanks, plus we also have tanks where we store bore water. We have our own bore in the backyard which pumps about 400 gallons of water per hour, and we store this in this tank here. Star, whose proper name is Marquis, is already a star, is the progeny of a horse called Marquis Star, which was quite a successful racehorse and jumper. Star had a successful early life as a racehorse, winning and placing in about 25% of his races. He did about 50 or 60 races and then retired at about 6 or 7 years old. He was then used for eventing and different things, and I got him as a 12-year-old, and we've hunted successfully ever since. He is now retired. He is now rising 22 and is retired. When I had my accident, I was going into a jump at the last second. Star lost his mind and decided to run off, but it was too late, so we both went over the jump sideways, him ending up on top of me, smashing my shoulder and leg to pieces. Apart from that, it was a successful day. I went to hospital in an ambulance, and I broke the top off my arm bone, the ball off the arm bone, and they had to put like a spoon shaped of metal on it with about 10 self-tappers, which they did. And so I'm slowly improving after 6 months. I'll tell you about Imp, the bay horse on my left. Imp. He was an excellent yearling, and they thought he would make a wonderful, wonderful racehorse. His sire was a horse called Danehill, which was Australia's top sire for a number of years running. And his dam, his mother's sire, was a horse called Sir Tristram, who was also a very famous horse. And so everyone had very high hopes for Imp, because he cost more than $100,000 when he was 1 year old. So he was a very expensive horse. When you see Imp, you should genuflect. He's so well bred, much better bred than our parents. And we also know who they were. I think the main draw card to people to Australia in general is the climate, and to South Australia in particular the climate, because it has what we call a dry Mediterranean climate, where you have cold, wet winters and hot, dry summers, with quite defined spring and autumn seasons as well, which is lovely. The big thing here in Australia is housing affordability, and particularly in Adelaide, housing is quite affordable. which is a major feature for a lot of people. I think South Australia is quite nice because we have a very large wine industry. We're a major wine exporter and make some fantastic wines here which compete successfully all over the world.
But just the local produce generally, like fruit, vegetables, all sorts of things grown here. It's lovely.
It's well known for its wine production, which brought out German settlers in the early days, and it's just really a nice place to live. Adelaide's not necessarily a very exciting place to go to visit, but it's a very good place to live. The Spitfire, I bought the Spitfire about 24 years ago, and it was in fairly run-down condition. I fixed it all up, and then for some obscure reason I lost my mind and I sold it about 12 years ago. However, just recently the chap who owned it mentioned to me that he might be getting rid of it, so I've re-bought the car again. And he hardly used it. The last time it was registered was 8 years ago, and it sat in a shed for the last 8 years. But unfortunately for 2 years before that, he kept it under a tree on his property, which didn't help the surface rust situation. But all in all, we've given it a good cut and polish, touched up all the things, and fixed the gearbox and the motor up and a few things like that, and it's running beautifully. Australia is very lucky because it has huge amounts of natural resources which can be mined and sold to other people. As far as the long-term situation goes, it can't last forever. But for the next several hundred years, I think Australia is going to be fairly right. At some point, though, we're going to have to start manufacturing and doing more value adding.
But we do have a problem with, in some ways, with the mining industry, because we seem to need more qualified and technical staff than any mine can supply, any company can supply. So people fly all over the country and from overseas to come and work in the mines here. So that's quite difficult to find enough people to work.
I think our plans are always to stay based in South Australia because of the enjoyable lifestyle and our friends and acquaintances. But I think we might possibly end up with a holiday home up in the Whitsundays near Airlie Beach, which is halfway up the Queensland coast, to go to in the winter time is to enjoy life there, with travel interspersed amongst this, with a little bit of work here and there.
Well, I agree. I like the house here. I like the Adelaide lifestyle. It does get cold in the winter, and Adelaide people are not very good at doing things like heating their houses and stuff like that, so because they don't think it is cold. So somewhere warm in winter would be absolutely lovely, and definitely some travel. We need to do some more travelling.